At Fort Carson, Colorado, a sniper training range on the outskirts of the military base steamed under the scorching afternoon sun. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, dust, and gun oil. Ben Carter, dressed in a battered combat uniform, his hat pulled low, slowly pushed a cart loaded with target accessories along the edge of the training range. He had a slight limp in his left leg, a reminder of a relatively infamous firefight in Kandahar years ago. Today, he's the equipment manager at the training range, a quiet, almost ignored veteran. On the training range, a team of elite snipers from various units across the base conducted routine training. The crisp crack of gunfire echoed in a rhythmic pattern, and a distant human target fell. Leading the team was the young Lieutenant Stevens, a high-spirited man with a certain pride in himself and his sharpshooters. During a break in training, Lieutenant Stevens, to boost morale, or perhaps to further demonstrate his ingenuity, clapped his hands and gathered all the men. "All right, guys, let's brainstorm," Stevens said, picking up an empty brass shell casing from the ground. "A classic sniper problem. Suppose your target is at this location." He tapped the ground with his foot, "and your only firing position is on the reverse slope of that little hill over there. You can't see the target, but you know the target's exact azimuth, range, and elevation difference. The wind is a steady 5 knots coming from the 3 o'clock position. You have a spotter with state-of-the-art observation equipment, but he also can't see the target. How can he give you the instructions you need to effectively execute an indirect aiming strike and secure a kill?" The men gathered around, frowning and whispering. Someone suggested using a laser rangefinder to calculate the target, but this was immediately rejected because the laser needed to be directly on the target. Someone suggested using a drone for guidance, but Stevens shook his head. "The rules restrict it. No air support. Just the two of you and the weapons you have." The discussion reached a stalemate. Shooting under such extreme conditions was more like a theoretical mathematical problem than a practical exercise. Lieutenant Stevens felt a little proud. He had raised the question simply to highlight the difficulty, not expecting anyone to have an immediate answer, let alone a practical one. This requires extremely complex trigonometric calculations and ballistics. And you have to consider the Coriolis effect and the curvature of the Earth ... a sergeant major pondered. "It's theoretically possible, but in reality, unless you have computer assistance, relying solely on human brainpower and manual calculations, is nearly impossible to complete within a reasonable time frame." "Indeed," Lieutenant Stevens nodded. "This is exactly what's testing us ... Before he finished, a low, slightly hoarse voice interrupted from nearby. The voice was low, but clear enough to drown out the murmurs. "We need an M24 or M2010 enhanced, equipped with the M118 LR long-range round, 7.62 mm caliber, muzzle velocity 780 meters per second, bullet coefficient 0.530. Everyone was stunned, their heads turning in unison. The speaker was Ben Carter, the veteran administrator. He had stopped working at some point and stood there, clutching a greasy rag. His eyes were obscured from beneath the brim of his hat, but his body stood straight, the slight limp seeming to have vanished. Lieutenant Stevens was surprised at first, then a hint of affronted. "Mr. Carter? We're discussing professional sniper tactics." His tone was thick with undisguised disdain, implying, "You have nothing to do here." Carter ignored his tone and continued speaking in a flat, unwavering voice, as if reciting data etched in his mind. "The spotter needs to move to a high vantage point on the flank, at least 300 meters away, where he can see both you and the approximate reference points in the target area. He'll need a scope with micro-degree angle measurement and a high-precision handheld weather station to measure the real-time microclimate. As he spoke, he slowly walked over to an unused tactical table nearby, brushed the dust off with his gnarled fingers, and began sketching simple geometric shapes and a series of dazzling formulas. He calculates the precise angle and distance difference between himself, you, and the target. Using trigonometric functions, he calculates the absolute offset of all firing parameters. This calculation must account for the effects of latitude, altitude, and humidity on the trajectory. His instructions won't be simple, left 1 microdegree, but correct azimuth by 30 microdegrees, correct elevation by 30 microdegrees, and estimate the bullet's flight time in x seconds. The entire training ground was utterly silent. Only Carter's deep voice and the rustling of his fingers in the dust filled the air. Complex parameters and calculations flowed from his mouth as smoothly as breathing. Lieutenant Stevens' mouth gaped, the arrogance on his face long since replaced by shock. How could you? Carter finally raised his head, his gaze sweeping across the stunned snipers before settling on Stevens's face. Then, following instructions, the sniper secures his rifle to a perfectly stable platform, relying on mathematics and trust, aims at a point he can't see, and pulls the trigger. He paused, then added, "This requires the utmost tacit understanding and absolute trust between the two. A slight error can lead to a huge error. This is impossible." A young sniper couldn't help but exclaim. Carter was silent for a moment. Then his gaze shifted to the designated target point in the distance, then to the hypothetical location of the reverse slope. That, he pointed to a nondescript mound, is an ideal firing position. The wind's closer to 6 knots, not 5. Lieutenant Stevens took a deep breath and challenged, "Mr. Carter, anyone can talk about theory. But it needs to be put into practice. Since you understand so well, could you demonstrate it?" It was an almost impossible request. Asking a 50-year-old equipment manager with limited mobility to demonstrate such top-notch sniping techniques that only existed in theory? Carter said nothing. He silently walked to the weapons locker and pulled out a meticulously maintained M201 sniper rifle, one of the weapons he meticulously cleaned daily. He also retrieved a set of observation equipment. He avoided the imaginary reverse slope and instead walked directly to a similarly situated high ground on the flank of the training ground, completely out of sight of the target. He motioned to the most astute-looking sniper, "You, be my spotter. Go to observation tower number 3. You can see the target, me." The soldier ran over in a daze. Carter began issuing clear, calm instructions over the radio, directing the observer on how to perform measurements and calculations. His instructions were professional, precise, and carried an undeniable authority. The observer stuttered back his data. Carter knelt on one knee, resting his rifle on a sandbag, his fingers rapidly calculating and recording in a small notebook, which he had pulled from his pocket. His movements were steady and practiced, a kind of muscle memory honed by years of practice. The entire training ground watched with bated breath. Lieutenant Stevens, his palms sweating, gazed at the distant target through binoculars. After several minutes, Carter seemed to have completed his calculations. He adjusted the scope, his finger lightly resting on the trigger. His breathing became long and steady, as if his entire being had vanished, merging with the surrounding landscape. Bang! A crisp gunshot crackled through the air. After a brief silence, the radio carried the observer in the watchtower's disbelieving, almost shaky cry. "Hit! Oh my God! Bullseye! How is this possible? He can't even see it!" Boom! The training ground erupted in a commotion. Everyone was stunned, staring at each other, their faces filled with shock and disbelief. Lieutenant Stevens lowered his binoculars, his face pale. He quickly approached Carter, his voice distorted. "Sir, who are you?" Carter slowly sheathed his rifle, unloaded the magazine, and checked the chamber. After doing all this, he slowly straightened up, returning to his slightly limping, silent equipment manager. He pulled a well-worn ID badge from his inner jacket pocket and handed it to Stevens. The lieutenant took it and looked at it, his pupils constricting. The information on the badge was simple, but one abbreviated unit designation exploded in his mind like thunder, a legendary designation, known only to a select few, representing the Army's highest precision, long-range lethality. Below it was a line of small text. Chief Sniper Instructor, Sergeant Major. Lieutenant Stevens snapped to attention, raised his right hand, and gave a perfectly standard, respectful salute. All the snipers behind him paused for a second before simultaneously standing at attention and saluting. Ben Carter, or rather, Sergeant Major Carter, looked at the young soldiers before him with a complex expression. He returned the salute slowly, somewhat awkwardly. "That's all in the past," he said, his voice still hoarse. He then picked up his rag, pushed the creaking cart, and limped on to the next target station requiring maintenance, as if the earth-shattering shot had been a mere blip in his daily routine. In the sunlight, only the snipers still saluting, and the still smoking, impeccably accurate bullet hole in the distant bull's eye remained.